Actually, I'm very fortunate to have this rare opportunity to try to discuss the question, very controversial issue, of course, the question of Confucian democracy. And so instead of saying there is something called Confucian democracy, I'm trying to imagine it. And yesterday a friend told me you have to imagine very hard in order to develop this idea. But even though the idea itself is still very much in its initial stage in terms of my own understanding of it, but I think it will have very far-reaching implications for years to come. And I'm very grateful to Professor Wang Ban and also to Professor Wang graciously accepted my offer actually to come to share ideas with you at Stanford. I did it last February for 2 or 3 talks, and I think it's a real great opportunity for me to develop some ideas that are still in the process of being formulated. Yesterday, a friend of mine who is very closely associated with Harvard University, I asked her about Stanford. She's very fond of Stanford. She said, well, you know, Stanford is excellent scholarship in paradise. So that's so I'm trying to develop some very tentative ideas in paradise. Hopefully some of the ideas will become more sustainable. The question of Confucian democracy is now widely debated, especially in China. It's very heated. It has far-reaching implications. But I'm critically aware of the fact that Lu Xunpai, a great scholar of Chinese political culture, once made the observation that Confucian democracy is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. It's like saying authoritarian equality. Never exists. It's totally wrong even to think about it. And he said it's possible to imagine Islamic democracy, but out of the question to talk about Confucian democracy. But Sam Huntington, as many of you know, argued, I think quite forcefully, say Confucianism as a form of soft authoritarianism may be congenial to democratization. In other words, compatible with the democratic process. And Peter Berger and a number of other scholars argue again quite forcefully that Confucian humanism may have contributed positively to the rise of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the so-called 4 mini dragons, and even economic vibrancy of the People's Republic of China. This is, of course, in the 80s. I don't want to go into all these very complicated discussions, but I simply want to think, hopefully you help me to think through this particular issue. And I would like to address this question, not Confucian democracy in the Confucian cultural area, which should include Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. I want to focus my attention on cultural China, which involves mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, the Chinese diaspora. And also, I'm critically aware of the fact that some of the liberal-minded thinkers, the most important thinkers in China in the last few decades, made it quite explicit that Confucianism as a form of feudalism is detrimental to China's modernization. The reasoning is quite familiar to all of us. First of all, Confucianism seems to be wedded to a form of agricultural-based economy. 小农经济 is one thing. And it's very much related to a family-centered social structure. And also a polity which is paternalistic, therefore authoritarian. So with agriculture-based economy, family-centered society, and hierarchical authoritarian polity as a form of life, it is incompatible with democracy. I'm quite aware of the lingering influence, very powerful influence of this perception. It's still very widely held by scholars in China. But if you look at the revival of Confucianism in China, since the May 4th generation, 1919 to 1949. Zhang Junmai, a great Confucian thinker, educated in Germany, and he came back, he became the great contributor to the Constitution of Republic of China. He actually drafted the first constitution, 宪法 of Republic of China, and was educated in Germany and a student of Liang Qicao throughout his life, devoted to the question about development of constitutionalism or 宪法 in China. And Xu Fuguan, who's one of my teachers, identified himself as a liberal Confucian, 自由主义的儒家. A liberal Confucian actually puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of democracy. And Mo Zhongshan, as many of you know, one of the most sophisticated philosophical minds in the 20th century, tried to develop this idea, can Confucian humanism develop its own version of democracy? 开出, is it possible for it to do it? And of course, the idea has been very widely critiqued. And Liang Suming was interested in the governance of local governments, 村治, so interested in the possibility of mobilizing Confucian resources for developing a modern conception of civil society. So these were efforts made by some of the great Confucian thinkers in the first generation of the revival of Confucian humanism in the 20th century. Now, they tried to do that. And of course, we continue to struggle with this particular process. But it may be useful simply to give you some concrete examples. I give you 3 examples about modern societies, definitely very much under the influence of Confucianism, and some of them become democratic, some were struggling to be democratic. And the first case is Singapore. And why I don't want to characterize Singapore as a Confucian society, but I simply want to note that since 76% of Singaporeans are Chinese, and they're deeply influenced by the Confucian habits of the heart. This, I think, is maybe beyond dispute. Now, to give you a very, very short scenario, Singapore came into existence in roughly 1965 when it declared independent. Immediately, Singapore recognized it as a tiny Chinese state in the Sea of Malays. In other words, a group of Chinese surrounded by Muslims. So Singapore first immediately considered its fate as comparable to that of Israel. So Li Guangyu sent his generals to Israel for training soldiers as well, and asked Israeli generals to try to help. And my personal experience, because I was involved in the so-called Confucian project in Singapore in the 1980s for about 10 years. The Deputy Prime Minister, Koh King Sui, who was both the Minister of Defense and Senior Deputy Prime Minister, confided to me, they said they were very serious about defending Singapore as a mini Israel in Asia. But when when the Israeli generals said, whenever there's a problem, you need to occupy these 2 mountain tops. And he looked up, both of them are in Malaysia. So he knew that Singapore was indefensible. He said, out of desperation, we opted for a Confucian way. I said, what is your Confucian way? Well, first, we want to see to it that Singapore is not conceived as a threat to the neighboring countries. In other words, the principle of reciprocity, do not do to others what you will not want others to do to you. First, to develop a profile which is so low, so self-effacing, that the neighbors do not consider you as a threat. So we did it. We just tried to show all kinds of collaboration. But the second one is more important. We try to develop a society that is considered beneficial to our neighbors. The Indonesians, the Malaysians consider Singapore's existence is not bad. How they did it? First of all, to build the best university possible. So Malaysian and Indonesian people come to be educated. To build the best hospital. So when their leaders become sick, they will come over here. To build the best bank, the best airport, the best seaport, the best airlines, and so forth. Of course, they managed to do that. More importantly, they try to develop this idea not only do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you, but if I flourish, I want to see to it that my neighbors flourish as well. In so doing, they somehow diffused at least unnecessary conflict. And then they enter into all kinds of collaboration. For example, Singapore needed water, so they negotiated with Malaysia. Malaysia say, okay, let's have a treaty for 10 years. We supply the water. I said, no, that's not good enough. Say 30 years. We increase the payment 30%. Malaysia considered that as a good deal, so they were established. You know, now Singapore has developed its own water resource through turning seawater into fresh water as one of the projects. Now they're totally sufficient. But anyway, just let Malaysians, Indonesians saw that Singapore needs them. And they actively involved in ASEAN. ASEAN is basically Indonesia's baby. That's part of the reasons that Singapore later developed this Pancasila, this comparable to the Pancasila idea. This is the Indonesian idea, 5 principles. Well, they're very Confucian, as you can see, but more complicated than it just on the surface. First of all, the principle that communal and national interest above the individual. The second principle, communal and national respect for the individual. The third, family as the basic unit for society. And the fourth, tolerance among religions. And the fifth one, it's harmony among races. As you know, Singapore is multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious. So Singapore developed this format. They said, now we're safe. And yet Singaporean, by any standard, is not a Confucian democracy. It's legalistic, for example, because of the influence of England, the British system, like Hong Kong. But yet, what they, I think, justifiably developed what they call responsible meritocracy. In other words, the more powerful, the more influential, the more gifted, and the more resources you will be able to develop, the more obligated you are for the well-being of the society as a whole. It manages to develop a very clean bureaucracy, perhaps the best, by comparison, even in some ways as good as the governance in Switzerland. So part of the reason is because their CEOs, the ministers earn as much as the CEOs of multinational corporations. So it's a very clean, responsible meritocracy trying to go through this ritual. I think the ritual is very important of election every 4 years, or every so many years. They never miss that. And the election basically is clean, even though the party is very dictatorial. So there's one party rule up to this point for how many years. But anyway, it's a form of polity, a form of society that is not Confucian, but many of the Confucian elements are actually relevant here. The second one, I think many of you are probably more familiar than I am, that's Taiwan. And Taiwan, in order to develop its own cultural identity against the encroachment of the People's Republic of China, consider Taiwan as the cultural renaissance, 文化复兴 of Confucianism. So at least at a rhetorical level, they all became, the young people were very much educated in Confucian classics. It's not a Confucian society, but Confucian elements are very important. And of course, Taiwan followed Sun Yat-sen's basic idea about democracy, which is not the division of labor in terms of 3 branches of the government, but 5. We are familiar with the 3, but Taiwan insists upon 2 other yuan, or 2 other ministries. One is examination, the other one is censorial. Very much rooted in the classical Confucian tradition, examination to recruit the best people to enter into the government. That's one principle. The other one is to develop a censorial system so any wrongdoing of the top leader is open to some form of sanction or criticism. I just learned recently that now, whether it's good or not, I'm not sure, 51% of the graduates of university in Taiwan want to become government officials, want to take the examinations to become, just like Hong Kong, everybody want to work for the government. Singapore, no question about it. You know how many Stanford graduates want to work for Washington, D.C., right? or Harvard students. Right? But in China now, incredible, the PRC. Again, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think it's probably very bad, especially for scholars in the humanities and social sciences. That overwhelming majority of the students want to take the very difficult examination to become government officials. But anyway, that's part of the story. But in terms of the cultural ethos, Taiwan is a very tolerant society in terms of religious coexistence. So the three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, of course, coexist. But also now they talk about 5 religions, Christianity and Islam. And Taiwan, in terms of religious tolerance, is an exemplar. Even though the population, the Christian population actually remained at about 3 to 5% for ever since the 80s. Before then, when Chiang Kai-shek promoted Christianity, Christianity flourished. But after Chiang Kai-shek's era, the real powerful religious tradition in Taiwan turned out to be Buddhism. But not ordinary Buddhism, not Theravada Buddhism in Thailand, but Mahayana Buddhism, especially the Buddhism, they call it, in Thailand, we use the term engaged Buddhism. In Chinese, we call it 人间佛教. It's the Confucian, it's the Buddhism that is totally compatible with Confucian humanism. This is, of course, the long story from Taixu to Yin Sun to now the 3 great Buddhist leaders of Xing Yun, Sen Yan, and Zhen Yan. They all consider themselves as Confucian Buddhists. In other words, the Buddhists who are not only interested in the Pure Land, the other shore, but interested in transforming the world here and now as an engaged public intellectuals. So that situation is fascinating. And then, I don't want to get into the politics, identity politics of Taiwan, but there's no question by any standard, Taiwan is a thoroughly democratic society. Certainly more so than Singapore, Hong Kong, but in some ways comparable to any democratic societies you can find out. It's not necessarily the best kind of democracy, but it's democracy to the core. That's why the Taiwanese leaders are all subject to all kinds of criticism. You can put a leader in jail. It's not easy for any societies. But Taiwan is thoroughly democratic. But what kind of democracy? Is it a very successful democracy? Is the kind of democracy, let's say Confucian democracy, you imagine that it be? No, not at all. But there's no question about the fact there are strong Confucian elements in the Taiwanese democracy. The third example is Hong Kong. When I first developed this paper, I don't know whether the paper is made available to you, but it's easily accessible now. I did write a paper, longish one, 55 pages or so, called Perspectives on Confucian Democracy, which will be published in a collection of essays edited by Larry Harrison, who's a very close associate of Sam Huntington. This was actually presented in Moscow 2 years ago, and it has nothing to do directly with democracy, but with the question of development and whether, I share many of my ideas here, so I don't want to repeat the arguments I stated there. The Hong Kong situation, when I wrote it, was relatively simple. Because Hong Kong, you say you are part of Hong Kong, then you are already part of China. But now it's very clear that there's a new kind of cultural identity that emerges in Hong Kong. 港人, who are we? The interesting reference, 30 years ago in Taiwan, when I grew up, I'm Taiwanese, automatically I'm Chinese. Then when the DDP became more and more powerful, independence became also quite significant as a political movement. I'm Taiwanese, I'm not sure whether I'm Chinese. Right now, 70% or 75% of the people you ask the question, 你是台湾人,你是不是中国人? I think 70% say no. So more than 70% of the people consider themselves Taiwanese, but not Chinese, 中国人. However, if you ask them whether you are 华人 or not, like 吕秀莲, we say, of course I'm 华人, I'm not, 我又不是日本人, I'm not Japanese, I'm 华人. So in English you have only one word, right? Chinese. But in Chinese we have 中国人和华人. So with the Taiwanese experience, we know that these two terms have assumed different cultural significance. 中国人 increasingly has become a territorial and a political entity. So I'm a member of I'm a citizen of the People's Republic of China. I'm a 中国人. I have the passport. That's I live in China. I live in Beijing, 中国人. And of course, then you have very complicated questions about the minorities. If you ask the question in China today, is Dalai Lama Chinese? Many people say, he should be, but we don't know. So then all the minorities, the Tibetans, the Mongols, the Uyghurs, and the 56 minorities, they should all be considered as part of China. But how China is not as wise, China today, political culture, is not as wise as the Manchu dynasty. Because Manchu dynasty was self-consciously multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilinguistic. And yet, the China today is overwhelmed by Han Chinese. The idea of Chineseness is very narrowly conceived, which of course may turn out to be politically very significant and may even turn out to be disastrous if you don't handle that situation well. But anyway, Hong Kong begins now to think, I am Hong Kongese, I'm a 香港人, whether I'm Chinese or not. And this is a major challenge to not only the Chinese self-perception, but also to Hong Kong's perception. Part of the reason is because it's very unhealthy conflict between Hong Kong people and the mainlanders. And you can understand Hong Kong residents feel threatened by not only tourists, of course, that's always a good thing. But if you're tourists also with many people who decide to deliver their babies in Hong Kong to purchase all the milk powders and at the expense of the local residents and behave really aggressively and refuse to abide by some kind of Hong Kong customs law and so forth. It's very understandable. Then you also have some of the stupid academicians made accusations or using a very, very negative expressions of Hong Kong, and the people became angry. So now Hong Kong's self-identification in terms of its own education, in terms of its legal system, in terms of its political structure, so all these elements are now very significant, and they are significant as the process of democratization is proceeding, and also very significant for anyone who wants to imagine a kind of Confucian democracy. Because in Hong Kong now, absolutely necessary to have any kind of democratic structure to have a healthy legal system. To say there's a difference between rule by law and rule by people, rule by person. And rule by person, 人治, as Confucian. Rule by law is not Confucian. This is total abusive understanding of what the Confucian democracy really is. So I've argued again and again, without legality, the kind of rule by person is not only un-Confucian, it's basically corrupt. So rule by law is a minimum condition, but it's not enough. You have to go beyond simply rule by law. That's a different story. So Confucian democracy then has to be a democracy in the best sense of the term, and has to be more. So that's how you have to imagine it, because it doesn't exist. And of course, the real challenge is what's going on in the People's Republic of China, in Dalu. Right now, the situation is very complicated, very intriguing to me, most exciting. And first of all, there's a debate within China. I don't want to get into this whole background understanding. Confucian revival in China is everywhere. And difficult to imagine any university without a Confucius Institute, 10 times larger than this one and richly endowed with a lot of people. So difficult to imagine any university without an Institute of National Learning, 国学, or Institute of Humanities. And that's just numerous. Peking University, for example, where I'm heading the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies, but that's only one of them. There's Confucius School, 儒学院. And this is also a school of the humanities, school of 国学院. So they're just numerous. And academies are being rebuilt, and many, right now, according to one account, more than 10 million youngsters from 8 to 13 can memorize the four books. And if you, many places like Shanghai, if you cannot recite the 弟子规, you're not being admitted to a primary school, privately owned primary school. It becomes a very important indicator whether you're educated or not. But therefore, emerges a form of, I would simply call it a form of Confucian fundamentalism. And this Confucian fundamentalism based upon the following argument, that Confucianism is the only culture that will be able to save China now. And Confucianism has to replace Marxism. Confucian religion has to be the national religion. That the Confucian constitutionalism, the Confucian democracy, should be the wave of the future. Now, this, of course, made known in the West because Daniel Bell and Jiang Qing published their idea about Confucian constitutionalism in the New York Times and generated a lot of discussions. Fukuyama is following this very carefully. And many Chinese scholars became extremely angry, especially liberal-minded Chinese scholars. What are they talking about? What they're talking about. So you do have one core group that really, I think, really has a strong belief that the Gongyang Chunqiu, a very important classic tradition, that could serve as the model for Confucian democracy in the future. I certainly do not have that enthusiasm at all. I feel it's a very significant and important indication of some of the possibilities in China, but it's an extreme form. But by far, the most important rhetoric is still the rhetoric of the liberal-minded Chinese intellectuals. If you want to find one tradition that's still the most powerful in China, it's liberalism. How you define it, it's difficult to say. It's liberal-minded traditions. And this group of people strongly believe that the Enlightenment values of the West, freedom, rationality, legality, human rights, dignity of the individual, these are the most basic core values and universal values China will have to embrace. There's no way out. If you have any kinds of excuse against any of these basic values, it won't work. And I basically subscribe to this line of thinking, but my position is a bit different from theirs. So that position is really at major conflict with the position of the so-called Confucian fundamentalists. Then you have a group of people who are very articulate, very sophisticated, very important, and of course charged with also a very strong political mission. That's the New Left, which again is powerful, 新左翼. And I know most of them, and we've been conversation partners for years and years. Again, it's difficult to generalize because each scholar has its own persuasion, its own orientation. But the general argument is this. There's a very strong resentment against post-colonialism or neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. A very strong sentiment against the American imposition of a way of life upon China. And of course, very much against our friend Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, saying that there's only one way, the liberal democratic way. So the American way, the regime change. Unfortunately, it's not the American way, but it's American way hijacked by very small conservative Republicans. I think sometimes you can imagine that as a very strange combination of the Christian right with market fundamentalism. Now, this position, in fact, of course, is totally untenable, even in America. But anyway, the new left is die-hard against this. And because of this, there are many implications. So you have Wang Shaoguang, who's educated at Yale and now in Hong Kong. I read quite a few of his things, and a very important theme is a very thorough critique of American democracy. Just saying that democracy doesn't work. In America, of course, democracy is hijacked by capitalism, the worst kind. If you don't have a billion, don't think about presidential election. If you don't have quite a few million, don't think about gubernatorial, any kind of elections. So without money, there's no democracy in America. And also the American dream is not exportable. There are many ways, and the American way of handling the economy is not an example for anyone, but not just Wang Shaoguang, but I think Gan Yang, after visiting the United States for a month, he went back, he said the last thing he ever wanted to visit again is the United States. There are no thinkers, there's no real freedom, there's no discussion. I was astonished, and yet the sentiments are understandable. Just consider nothing we can learn as Chinese from America. And many of them are really a very successful American, successful scholars in China, deeply educated in America, very deeply educated. Then you have much more sophisticated observations of this by many other scholars as well. I think perhaps one of the most sophisticated versions of this particular critique is by people like, I think Liu Xiaofeng is also very deeply involved in doing this from the Christian point of view earlier. Wang Hui, I think by far the most sophisticated, and of course changing his own position to adjust to a very complicated situation outside. But anyway, because the Chongqing case, as you know, all of them, I don't know why, all of them went to Chongqing and felt Bo Xilai got it right. So all of them, Gan Yang, Cui Ziyuan, Wang Hui, he didn't go, but he really wanted. He couldn't go. And Wang Shaoguang, Liu Xiaofeng. So that's one extreme. And then you have the people who really consider themselves as liberal-minded reformers, with a lot of emphasis on the market economy, the reform. I think Zhang Weiying is a good example at Peking University, but quite a number of others. The Tianze group, I think. So the intellectual atmosphere in China is very complicated. And so in this context, how do I try to imagine Confucian democracy in this context? There are three currents of thought, powerful ones in China. Liberalism on the one hand, and Marxism on the other, and traditional Chinese culture, Confucianism. So the three major currents of thought. In the 80s, the liberal tradition was so powerful that all the way led to the Tiananmen. And the perception is this: the so-called Marxist tradition, the ideologists, who were really Stalinists, using political power as a way of controlling all resources. So it's a kind of Stalinistic dictatorship. The so-called traditionalists, in fact, the so-called Confucians, were in fact still very much a part of the feudal legacy. So China's problem was the collusion between Confucian feudalism and the Stalinistic, of course, Maoist Stalinistic dictatorship. Therefore, the only way out is to underscore the importance of the liberal tradition, the market, ideas of human rights, and in order to change the landscape. Therefore, there's no real reconciliation. It's a real conflict. And now in the 90s, these three traditions somehow coexisted, not peacefully. The market economy is going strong. Now, China has become a market society already. So every aspect of society is being marketized. It is in this sense that not just the government, but the academic community, the business community, even religion is being corrupted. So corruption is a major problem for China because of the total marketization of society. And yet, the reform, the idea of the reform, no matter how you do it, the period today, no matter how unequal the society is, all the conflicts, it's better than the period of the Cultural Revolution. After all, more than 500 million people became uplifted from abject poverty, unheard of in human history. And so the livelihood of everyday Chinese has been greatly improved. And even though the Gini coefficient now is 4.5, which means China following South Africa is the worst, then Nigeria, Brazil, then China, and United States followed China. And the situation is totally unsustainable. We know that, the rich and the poor. And yet, reform has to be continued. There's no way out. The possibility of the return of the Maoist era, the return of something that Bo Xilai imagined possible, and that with his collapse becomes remote. And then the question for the new regime, is how to continue with the so-called reform, which means to deal with the problem of income maldistribution and the conflict between the rich and the poor and corruption. In order to do that, there's a major restructuring of not only the party apparatuses, but even reshaping the ethos are absolutely necessary. Symbolically, really have to do that. Is it doable? Nobody knows. So in the next 3 years or 4 years, you can either see China gradually moving out of a very, very difficult period. The economic downturn is unavoidable, and find a way which is not necessarily ideal, but a way it's not only can be tolerated, but a way that would be a source of inspiration for developing countries and a challenge, a real challenge to the European community and the United States. In other words, a Chinese dream that can really be dreamed. Not unlike the American dream, because the American dream cannot be sustained in America. If the European communities want to do that, then you need another Earth. If Asia wanted to follow the American dream like Chinese, you need 3 Earths. Totally unsustainable. The American economic situation is going to be truly bad. The European situation is not good at all. So if China can somehow work out a way, there's no internal disintegration. Can this be some kind of imagined Confucian democracy? This is what I'm trying to suggest. First of all, the Enlightenment legacy, which everybody can accept it as universal, or at least universalizable values, will have to be put on the highest priority in the reform agenda. What are some of these values? First of all, some measure of freedom, especially freedom in terms of expression. China just cannot control the press, control the TV, control the internet the way China feels that it can do. China can't, because nobody is willing to give up his right or her right to say something. If everybody is willing to use the Weibo to express himself or herself, and the situation is very fluid. So unless some measure, some mechanism will be developed, responsible public reasoning is possible. Otherwise, the situation will always be considered chaotic. So some form of liberalization is absolutely necessary. This is related to another great Enlightenment value, is rationality. And this rationality is to say the government, together with the leaders, I would say leaders in all sectors of society, in the mass media, in business, in the academic community, in religion, in other sections of society, are willing to get involved with the public reasoning. Now, there are two ways of looking at democracy, radically different ways. Both are reasonable. One is the Schumpeter approach, which Huntington uses. That is election and multi-party system. Without election, regular election, no multi-party, there's no democracy. By that standard, China cannot become democratic in the next few years. China will take a long, long time for China even to be considered as a democratic society. There's another very important feature of democracy, that is public reasoning. This is the one that Amartya Sen and Michael Sandel, many other people have argued. In other words, suddenly you realize there are responsible public intellectuals in the society that are willing to express themselves in an authoritative and responsible way. And these ideas will have to be translated to policy formation. And the government just cannot afford not to listen to them. And gradually they become more and more vocal, and they're not simply government employees. They have their independent mindedness. This, of course, the great Chinese tradition of 公论, the public reasoning. So can that be done? Right now, it is possible. Even argument, I can see in Taiwan, the most interesting thing about Taiwan is that the Taiwan voting record, if you see the Taiwan people when they vote, it's very, very intelligent and reasonable. They never voted the way that would lead Taiwan to disaster, political disaster, either vis-a-vis men in China or vis-a-vis their own structures. So the reasonableness of not just the middle class, of the voters, can we appeal to that kind of sense? We don't know. Another thing is human rights. And the human rights discourse will have to be very widely embraced, because China signed all the declarations. The United States, maybe 15 of the major ones never signed. But China signed all of this. Of course, now you should deliver. Religion, in particular. I think the major problem China is going to face with the leadership is religion. And both internal and external. External is Christianity, a religion of freedom, freedom of religion. Internally, it's Tibetan Buddhism. And I will even argue very forcefully, China will have to begin a real dialogue with the Dalai Lama. Not a dialogue with the unification, with the united people, united front people. 统一战线. You have to get one of the top leaders to see a dialogue is going to take place. If you allow more people to suffer from immolation, right now over 100, and the China's, not just the soft power, the China's public image outside will be ruined in a very short period of time if the confrontation comes. I just give you an example. If, say, the Dhammasara decided there's no way we can have anything to do with China, we just want to confront China. And the Dalai Lama decided that not even say I'm part of the autonomous regime. I want to be independent, because China, this situation is insufferable. Now, every university in the United States will have a pro-Tibet student movement. The Falun Gong will be considered. Falun Gong has made a lot of trouble for Chinese diplomats. But if the whole Tibetan movement turns against China, I think China cannot deal with the situation that effectively. Especially now, the Chinese diplomacy is in a very difficult shape. Almost every neighbor is involved in some kind of confrontation, from Japan to to North Korea, not to mention Vietnam and the Philippines and so forth. So the situation, you have to get out of this situation. And of course, by far the most important is legality. And this China can learn from Hong Kong, can learn from Singapore, can learn from Taiwan. And how you develop a mechanism where really the blatant corruptions will have to be put to a stop. If you don't do that, I think Hu Jintao said, 王党王国. Yeah, definitely. If you don't do that. So this is the situation. So my suggestion is this. Anyone who's interested in Confucian humanism will first recognize that the Enlightenment idea of the economic man, why not good enough for human flourishing in the long run, is absolutely necessary for China to emulate. What is an economic man in terms of the Enlightenment? I think, by the way, I've talked to quite a few Stanford students, and the idea is the economic man. Every Stanford student wants to become an economic man. An economic man is someone who is a rational animal. So absolutely rational, because rationality is calculated by the person's ability to understand his own self-interest. Motivated by a strong desire to maximize his or her profit, let's say, 利润, profit, in a relatively free market adjudicated by law. That's an economic. So, because that's true with most of the students we met, they work hard, they're all careerists. They want to get a fair share of the resources. They don't want to violate any laws. They know their self-interest. They want to maximize their profit. They want the competition to be fair. Some great values are embodied in this idea of the economic man. First, the freedom. You have the freedom and independence to choose your own career, your development. The second one is rationality. Everybody's calculating very clearly what you want to do. The third one is rights. That's my right. I have the right to maximize my profit. And of course, legal constraint. I know the game is a fair one. In China, the game is not fair. So no matter how hard you try, if you're not well connected, you're not going to make it. And of course, a very, very important feature is the dignity of the person. One thing about globalization is that individual choices have been multiplied. We have so many choices. The more modern and more global we are, the more choices we're going to have. And the possibility for one person to stay at the same job for the next 10 or 15 years, to do the same thing or to stay in the same kind of social relationships, that's not possible. Very fluid. Everything is changing very rapidly. There are a lot of choices going on. But you have to do it. There's competitiveness, but the competitiveness has to be fair. So allow the Chinese, the young, brilliant Chinese people to know China is developing a legal system that is basically open. And so you can have some basically sustainable way of, at least a predictable way of doing work. And in this sense, I would say, if you advocate Confucian democracy and believing you have to challenge human rights, Daniel Bell, Roger Ames, and many people begin to challenge human rights and say, we have something better than human rights. What? Without human rights? What is better? You don't challenge human rights. You can say we want to be more than human rights. We need to have human rights. We need to have something more than human rights. If you begin to challenge human rights, say we have a Confucian democracy which is not based upon human rights, not based upon legality, not based upon rationality, not based upon freedom. This you fall into the trap of what Li Guangyao is trying to say. We Singaporeans don't need all these liberties. They just listen to me. And I will tell them how to behave properly. Are we going to get rich? Everybody. Can you do that in China? No one has the authority, the authoritative voice to do that. Lee Kuan Yew could have done it because he's basically clean and he was respected. He had tremendous charisma. Mahathir didn't do it well in Malaysia, right? I don't think that can be repeated. There's no way anyone is going to challenge these universal and universalizable values, such as human rights, such as law, such as the people's ability to express themselves and so forth. So even though China may never be able to develop a kind of electoral system, everybody can vote, but to say voting itself is not right, it's ridiculous. Everybody would like to say, I don't want to vote, but I have the right to vote. Now you manage to do that at the village level. So more than 100 million Chinese have experience of voting now. If you don't move it to the other, to the township or to the citizen, that's fine because you have problems. But to use the justification, Chinese are not ready because they are not well educated. Who's well educated? You think the top leader is well educated? Is morally astute to do that? India is the greatest, largest democracy in the world, and India, ever since 1948, continues to be a democracy. India's strength as a democracy is a clear demonstration that this argument about elitism, you have to know certain kind of education, certain kind of mindset to be democratic. It's not going to work. However, you really have to develop a vision of human flourishing way beyond enlightenment. If you don't have that vision, China is doomed. China will never be able to compete with advanced democracies such as the United States. What you need to do is to say they are values, absolutely critical for human survival and human flourishing, that are absent in the Enlightenment and absent in the economic man. If these values are not developed, even if we can embody freedom, embody rationality, embody human rights, embody legality, and embody the idea of dignity of the individual, it's not enough. What are some of these values? In addition to freedom, we need to have the value of justice, fairness. Why a theory of justice has been so powerful in America? Why Sandel's republicanism? America is a liberal tradition. Why it's not good enough simply to put the emphasis on freedom. The Islamic world has put a lot of emphasis on justice. The jihad, in a way, is for justice. Jihad, in the true sense of the term, is spiritual self-transformation. It is not a war against anyone else. So that notion of justice. In addition to rationality, to me even more important is sympathy, empathy, and compassion. You have a group of extremely successful business people. They manipulate the financial institutions. People work for Goldman Sachs. And they are beneficiaries of the system. And they haven't violated any law because there are no laws to govern this complicated world. The science and technology enables the financial system to be so volatile, so fluid. So you can say, I'm willing to take risk, and then I either become totally broke or totally bankrupt, or I become a billionaire. I want to do that. And some of the people manage to become billionaire, not because of their own effort, but because of the whole system itself is basically irrational. So if you do not have a group of people who are trained to be responsible, especially leaders, responsible, decent, sympathetic, and compassionate, the world is going down the drain. I think in America we know how difficult it is to develop even the notion about empathy or sympathy or of decency. So that's a big problem. Now, in addition to human rights, you need to have human responsibility, right? The category of responsibility is not in the economic man. You need it. And the category of civility, in addition to legality, needs to be there. The idea of social harmony, in addition to personal dignity, ought to be there. So you have all the basic Confucian values. You have 仁义礼智信. The reason a leader in America will have to understand, in addition to liberty, justice, 正义, justice, 公义, in addition to rationality, sympathy. Obama's success, in a way, is not because he's considered extremely efficient. People find that he can cry, right? He can show his compassion that's genuine. Very different from, the tough-minded politicians like Bush Jr., right? And then you have this very, very important idea that the leadership training, right now we have the leadership training, it's just technology, just cognitive intelligence, just economic capital, and material conditions. There are many, many other things. We have the emphasis on cultural competence, on social capital, on emotional or ethical intelligence, on spiritual values. They're all relegated to the background. These need to be brought to the forefront for discussion. So then, a society like China, I'll give you one example. I think it's one of the most precious resource in Chinese society that not being very widely recognized, even though many people pay lip service to it. When you talk about, for example, right now, in the academic community, when you get together, basically people talk about three things. What kind of new car you have, what kind of new house you have, then the education of their children. These are the three major topics. And let's leave the first two aside. Just put the one on the third one, is education for the young. I don't know whether you read the Lee article in the Sunday Times. The reporter followed this Chinese sophomore for 7 years. So the parents, the great commitment of the parents of this girl was to find a way that she can go to college. That's all there. That's their ultimate concern. So the father and mother worked 7 days a week, and just save enough money for the daughter to get into a college, not even a leading college, a regular college. The daughter complains every day and she wants to resign, she wants to get out, she wants to do something, and so forth. So to find a way to educate the young, it's a civil religion in China, in the Confucian influence. I just came back from a trip in Oxford, organized by many of the students there. And the couple who hosted my stay, the husband came from a well-to-do intellectual background, but the wife, her parents sold ice cream on streets 15 years ago. Then they saved some money and then saved another. They worked for 15 years and eventually saved up 2 million RMB. It's incredible. And invested the money completely on the education of this daughter of theirs. Sent her to England for boarding school. And after boarding school, to Oxford for 4 years. And exhausted every penny after she graduated from Oxford for 4 years, the 2 million RMB. And then she got one of the rare fellowships from Oxford. Everything's covered. She's in chemistry. I say, she's only a graduate student. How could she get this kind of support? Well, we realized she already published 3 or 4 referenced articles in scientific journals as a PhD candidate. And her work in chemistry, brilliant work. So one of the few full-time scholarship of doing that. Now these stories are numerous. So the willingness to sacrifice the livelihood of your own or even your own future for the sake of the next generation. This is a vision that we need. This is a kind of resource that is really extremely precious. So I would suggest that if it is possible for the leadership to articulate a roadmap for China, whether you call it Confucian democracy or not, at least a responsible meritocracy, a roadmap, saying, look, this is our vision. Not for the future, say 15, 20 years, just for the next 5 or 6 years, or during our tenure, 10 years. The vision is, first of all, we want to make sure that internal security is really secure. Now spending, the only 2 items more expensive than national defense. One is internal security. The other one, of course, it's entertainment for the officials. But anyway, we want to do it. We want to see to it that our society, the overwhelming majority of the people, will have a livelihood that could sustain, even to get out of this middle income trap. We'll do our best to do this. And we are not going to, at least to learn from Turkey, so we're not going to have to become confrontational with any of our neighbors. Turkey's idea is zero conflict. We first learn, try to get out of this narrow-minded nationalism. Sovereignty is not as important as human rights. Sovereignty is a 19th century manufactured idea. And how to get rid of this narrow-minded idea of sovereignty. It's not easy, because your own legitimacy may be in question. If you don't fight against Japanese, if you don't criticize the Japanese, your own legitimacy is in question. But now fighting Japanese is not going to help you to get out of this malaise, because the overwhelming Chinese majority are not interested in fighting Japanese. They're interested in fighting corrupt officials. So how you make a sense, this what we do now is for real. It's not just for our own interest. And to negotiate it with the major countries, with the United States, with England, with France, and to develop a mechanism. For example, when Hu Jintao was in Washington, he complained to Obama there are only 2 conflicts. If we resolve the 2 conflicts, the Sino-American relationship would be in pretty good shape. The one is selling weaponry to Taiwan. This, of course, is totally ridiculous. How can the United States justify selling weaponry to Taiwan? But the second one is that you receive Dalai Lama. Obama just didn't understand what he was talking about. How can any Western leaders, Obama, Merkel, or the former Sarkozyans, how could they refuse to receive Dalai Lama? They can, because the public opinion would just fight against them. So China, right now, China really perceives as the Dalai Lama as a major threat. Can that be turned into, at least first turn it into neutral, and then even turn into a resource? Who knows? And I think this may not work. I think the workability for me in the next few months is zero. But at least you can imagine the possibility of something of this nature. Thank you.